Recording in 3, 2, 1. Intro. A Wicked Sobriety production. Welcome to the Dirtbag Adventures podcast, an in-depth interview-style podcast about outdoor recreation by Wicked Sobriety Productions, hosted by me, Derek Kern. Listen now for free wherever you get your podcasts, links in the show notes. Dirtbag Adventures episode 005, Murder on the AT. This is the first solo style podcast that I have recorded. If you listen to the introductory episode, you would have heard me say that I was going to do 2 interviews per month with a solo style about true crime related to the outdoor world in some sort of fashion in between the 2 interviews. So it just worked out that the first 3 or 4 guests I wanted to interview happened very spontaneously, and I just went ahead and made it happen, got everything edited and pushed out. So I'm now getting around to doing the first solo style that I wanted to do. As you heard in the title, this is going to be about murder along the AT. Just for those out there who are not familiar with what AT stands for Appalachian Trail. And there will be a couple of other things that you hear me say along in this episode, such as the BMT, which stands for Benton-MacKaye Trail. And then there will also be another abbreviation that is ATC, which stands for Appalachian Trail Conservancy. And you will also hear me refer to the name I just said, Benton-MacKaye, as Benton-MacKaye. I've always said Benton-MacKaye. I'm pretty sure it's pronounced MacKaye, but for the sake of the recording and of the video version, I will be pronouncing it as MacKaye. The information that I'm going to be reading from today, I found the information from an article on strangeoutdoors.com, and it was dated March 15th of 2021. I also sourced some other information from Wikipedia and a website called greenbelly.com. The freelance writer who had the information up on greenbelly.com was Katie LaCavali. So I'm going to give credit where credit is due. This is not my information. This is information sourced from these websites, and I will cite the sources again at the end of the podcast, just for safe references. The first thing we're going to do here is I'm going to talk a little bit to you about statistics of the AT and maybe a small brief history. The Appalachian Trail was first proposed in 1921 by a gentleman named Benton-MacKaye. The trail was completed in 1937 after more than a decade of work, spanning 2,194 miles, with its southern terminus being Springer Mountain in North Georgia and its northern terminus being Mount Katahdin in Maine. The AT is considered by the ATC, Appalachian Trail Conservancy, to be the world's longest hiking trail. I think this may be challenged now, the part about being the longest hiking trail. I didn't look up any information on that specifically, but I do know that there have been a couple of other trails that people have been through hiking that may challenge this statement now. So just kind of keep that in mind. The AT passes through 14 states. It averages 3 million visitors per year, with approximately 2,000 registered through hikers. Not all 2,000 make the complete journey. On average, only around 700 succeed each year. A World War II veteran named Earl Schaefer is usually regarded as the first person to through hike the entire trail, and he did that in 1948. So with these statistics that I just read to you, this is how they stack up against crime. And for crime, I'm gonna specifically reference murder for the sake of the next several episodes in the solo edition. There has been on average, there's a murder along the Appalachian Trail every 4 years since 1974. With 3 million visitors annually, this means that there is less than 0.000003% of being murdered on the AT. The ATC and NPS, National Park Service, rank heart attacks and other health-related issues as a leading cause of death along the AT, with falling and drowning being a close second. So for this particular episode, this is going to highlight the very first murder that was ever recorded or documented that happened along the AT. And it's going to take us all the way back to May of 1974. May 9th, specifically, a gentleman named Joel Paulson and his lady friend Margaret McFadden started their AT hike at the southern terminus, so Springer Mountain. And from here, they climbed steadily and sometimes unmercifully as it wanders northwards towards Fontana. Now, I'm just going to stop right here and say right out of the gate that as I was reading this article, I was getting kind of aggravated because as an experienced hiker, they got some of the information wrong in the article. The mileages and the distances covered, the areas they stayed, the areas they were headed, they're not. They do exist, but they're not at all how this article makes it. So, the article says that from the very beginning, Joel and Margaret both this was the first times. They were very unseasoned hikers, maybe with only a couple of day hikes under their belt or under their legs. She got a blister on her foot. Margaret got a blister on her foot within less than a mile after the hike started. So they stopped for lunch, and then within only 6 miles, it was late evening, and they decided to pitch camp at a shelter known as Low Gap. So if anybody who is familiar with the AT knows the mileages, it is far more than 6 miles from Springer Mountain to Low Gap. It's more like probably 45, maybe even roughly in the 50 miles from Springer Mountain. So I'm not really sure where they got the first 6 miles of the AT, but that's neither here nor there. Also, one of the other issues I had with this first little statement this article made is that I know of, or that I've been around other folks, even people who are not seasoned hikers usually don't get a blister on their feet within only 1 mile. It takes several miles to get a blister on your feet. And again, if you're an experienced hiker, you know it's all about the way the shoes fit and the type of socks you're wearing. So even if she was wearing shoes that were too big or was wearing cotton socks, I mean, I don't know if she would get a blister on her foot within 1 mile. I've never met anybody that has gotten a blister in that short amount of time period. So we just kind of take that with a grain of salt. So after 6 miles, they found Low Gap Shelter. They are worn out and ready to rest and camp for the day. As they make their way into the shelter, they find another hiker already settling in for the afternoon. And this guy is going to go by the name of Ralph. According to later accounts from Margaret, Ralph appeared homeless, down on his luck, and it looked like he hadn't had a shower in a while, which is pretty common. Margaret remembered him having a small pile of belongings, including a blanket, leather jacket, canvas rucksack. He didn't appear to be a hiker, and he was wearing a sway-soled desert boots and didn't have any proper gear. And I just want to interject here again. I'm not really sure what proper gear would have been in 1974. Obviously, today in 2023, our gear has far surpassed anything that would have ever been around in 1974. But the little bit of research I did do on what the gear would have been in 1974 is basically a heavy external frame pack or an old rucksack. He did have a blanket and he had a jacket as well. So he hadn't showered and he appeared homeless. And all these things are things that I think of when I go on the AT even today. Not showering or appearing homeless, like that's kind of the dirtbag. That's kind of the hiker dirtbag look. At this point, apparently the three have a brief conversation. Margaret gets mad. She leaves the shelter and goes over to the nearby spring to clean up. Joel joins her a bit later, saying that he didn't know that he trusted Ralph and that he didn't like him. There's no details discussed about specifically what they conversated about. Maybe Ralph just gave off a bad vibe, or or Ralph was asking or talking about some things that they just didn't really find to be normal. So sun drops, the evening fades into night. The three of them end up starting a fire. They cook dinner. Joel and Margaret offer Ralph some of their dinner. He declines. Joel and Margaret eat their dinner. Ralph retreats to the woods to bring in firewood. Margaret and Joel decide they should leave first thing in the morning, and they'll make breakfast when they were a mile or two up the trail. So their plan. So at this point, Joel and Margaret have made it to the first shelter. They have met a man named Ralph. Ralph is giving off some bad vibes, and neither one of them care to be around Ralph in the shelter, so they decide that at first light in the morning, they're going to get up and they're going to hike out of there pretty much as quickly as they can. They'll stop somewhere down the trail and fix themselves some breakfast. They go to bed. The night passes uneventfully. At first light, Joel wakes Margaret, and they get moving. This is kind of where things start going south for Joel and Margaret. So Joel leaves the shelter and heads for the stream to brush his teeth and wash his face. And by stream, they just mean the spring. At Low Gap, there's not really a stream. It's just a small trickle of water. As Joel's leaving the shelter, Ralph is also leaving the shelter. Margaret was left alone as she's getting dressed. Margaret hears a gunshot. Margaret looks out to investigate and sees Joel fall almost in the fire ring outside of the shelter. And next proceeds a series of events, and this is where I mix some of the information from different articles together. There wasn't a single article that had every bit of information, just bits and pieces, and each article was different on the bits and pieces they shared. So I just kind of mashed them all together. So after killing Joel, Ralph comes back to the shelter and he holds Margaret at gunpoint. He ties her hands behind her back with twine and he marches her into the woods behind the shelter, sits her at the base of a tree, pulls her legs around the tree and ties her feet together, then blindfolds her. He leaves and is gone for some time. It was estimated by Margaret by a later account that it was probably in the 10 to 20 minute time range, but it could have been longer. She didn't really know. Time was kind of just there. So eventually Ralph returns. He removes her blindfold. He unties her and he leads her back to the shelter where Joel was now gone. And Ralph tells Margaret, quote, "I got rid of him." At this point, Ralph orders Margaret to eat and drink while he's going through Joel's hiking pack. He's looking for money. Doesn't find any cash, but he does find traveler's checks. So after finding the traveler's checks, Ralph decides that he doesn't really want to deal with Margaret after all, and he leads her back into the woods, this time a little further from the shelter. She guesstimated about 200 yards. He once again he once again has her sit facing a tree, positions her legs around the trunk. He ties her feet together, and this time he ties her hands behind her back. He tries to hide her hiking pack by covering it with leaves, and then wedges his own rucksack behind her as a backrest. He then tells Margaret he would leave a note in the shelter saying where she was. He filled Joel's pith helmet with water and placed it beside her and left behind a bag of granola in her lap. He balanced Joel's watch on a log so she could read its face, then leaves the area, and sometime later, Ralph returned saying he was worried she wouldn't be found. He told Margaret she could stay where she was or hike out of the mountains together and reach a highway for help. She obviously chooses to hike out of the woods. I'm sorry, guys. This the article, the way it's written, it's sort of hard to follow. So just kind of bear with me. Back to the AT and headed north. Margaret, with her hands now untied and Ralph behind with his gun. Ralph threatens her that if they run into anyone and Margaret says anything or make any moves to signal that there's something wrong, he'd kill everyone. So not long after they start north, they decided to take a rest. As they're resting, two men with chainsaws come into view. One of them, the same forester she and Joel had spoken with the day before. Most likely an AT volunteer section maintainer. So just a little bit on that. There is a group of people who are called AT volunteers, and the AT is broken down into sections, generally from road to road. So some sections can be 4 miles, some sections can be 8 miles, some sections can be 15 miles. In the Smoky Mountains, you're looking at a section that might be 45 miles without a road crossing. And each section, depending on size, has probably anywhere from 4 to 10 people who come out and maintain the trail. And by maintain the trail, they mean they come out, they cut trees out of the way, they make water diversions, they fix erosion, just all these things to keep the trail nice. Again, it sees 3 million visitors per year, so somebody has to go out and help maintain it. Margaret was worried that the two men would notice she was walking with another man, and by the facial expressions they did, but didn't focus on it as they were in a hurry. Ralph questioned one of the men about the next road crossing to the north, and the man replied it was a long hike before heading their way. So this section that they're hiking is a semi-difficult section, but maybe it was more difficult in the 70s because I've hiked it several times in the recent past, and it's not really all that difficult. So just kind of a recap on where we're at this point. Joel and Margaret set out on their AT hike. They find a shelter with a man named Ralph, spend the night. Ralph shoots Joel the next morning, and now he has kidnapped Margaret, and they are on their way to find the next road. Margaret now leads Ralph over a narrow, more difficult path, roots and rocks on a ridge high above the Chattahoochee River. Ralph told her that he had escaped from jail and that he felt out of his element being in the woods. He wanted to get back west, which meant moving light and fast, and so he had stolen Joel's gear. They came to the Rocky Knob shelter where they rested before sending a steep 150-yard side trail to the spring where Ralph filled his canteen. He retrieved a trail map from Joel's pack and was surprised to find the next road crossing was less than 3 miles away. So the Rocky Knob shelter no longer exists. I personally have been hiking on the AT in the Georgia section from Springer to Dix Creek Gap for well over 10 years. I've made many different hikes along the trail, and Rocky Knob shelter has not ever been there in the last 10 years. The 150-yard side trail to the spring is the headwater of the Chattahoochee River. I've also personally gotten water from this exact spot almost every time that I hike through the area. At this point, Ralph is realizing that he has a lot invested with Margaret. He decides as they break for water to hit her with the plan. He tells Margaret that he would not be letting her go, and he has planned when they reach the next road crossing, instead, they would hitch a ride together to the nearest town and get a motel room, and he'd let her go in the morning. Ralph once again warned her, if you say anything, everyone dies. Let's see. I'm just trying to figure out. So Ralph, they make it to the next road crossing, which would be alternate 75 out of Helen. And they are trying to catch a ride. And nowadays, bumming a ride in like North Carolina where the trail goes isn't that hard of a thing to do. In Georgia, it's pretty difficult to get a ride. I've tried to thumb a ride here multiple times and it's hard to do, but Ralph and Margaret, within a very short amount of time, a young woman pulls over and offers to give them a ride. Once they're in the car, Ralph told her they had traveler's checks but had lost their IDs. Did she know of a place that would overlook that? The woman replies, she knew of a place 9 miles south of Unicoi Gap, a Bavarian-themed restaurant called Wursthaus. With Ralph holding his gun, Margaret asked whether she could cash a $20 traveler check and where they could stay. They were directed to the Chattahoochee Motel. When they arrived, Ralph asked for a room, handed over $10, and signed the registration as Mr. and Mrs. Joel Polson. At a restaurant next door, they bought food and beer and brought them back to the room and watched an Elvis Presley movie on the TV. Ralph practiced Joel's signature so he could cash his traveler's checks. He then tells Margaret that if she wanted to keep a memento of Joel, she was welcome to go through his pack. She left it as it was. Margaret wants to take a shower, so she asks Ralph. Ralph follows her into the bathroom and watches her to stop her from climbing out the window. Then after the shower, Margaret goes to bed and she sleeps with Ralph in a chair with a gun. Or she sleeps in the bed and Ralph slept in a chair with a gun. The next morning, they head back to the Wursthaus restaurant to cash more traveler's check. The restaurant had no money in the till, so they headed to a gas station up the street where Ralph got $20. At this point, Margaret and Ralph returns to the Wursthaus for coffee. Ralph changed his plans again, saying they'd find a bus station in Cleveland, Georgia, and then they'd go their separate ways from there. So they hitch a ride to Cleveland's Trailway station where Margaret asked the man at the counter for a ticket to Columbia via Atlanta first. He pointed out that she could go to Cornelia, a town of the southeast which had a Greyhound station with buses directly to the east. They then hitch yet another ride to Cornelia, and while waiting for the bus, they talked to a nearby bank to cash. They stopped by a nearby bank to cash more travelers' checks. After a quick lunch at the restaurant around the corner, they returned to the bus station where the manager appeared and unlocked the door. Margaret bought a $10 ticket for Columbia. Ralph stepped up to the counter and purchased a $3 ticket to Atlanta. Ralph's bus, due in first, was running late, but eventually arrived, and Margaret watched the bus pull away. After a tense wait, her own bus arrived a short time later. It was dark when the Greyhound reached Columbia, and Margaret tried to reach her elder brother, who lived nearby but got no answer and failed to also get a response from her parents. So at this point, she decides that she needs to phone the Columbia police, and she told them the whole story from the time they left to the time that she got into Columbia. The call was relayed from South Carolina to Georgia, and the sheriff of Atlanta at the time, Sheriff Frank Baker, summoned backup from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. On Saturday, May 11th, GBI, Georgia Bureau of Investigation, Special Agent Stanley L. Thompson was woken and headed with the sheriff to the Logap shelter to investigate. They found Joel covered with forest debris across the stream from the shelter. His head was in a plastic bag, and the bag had been tied around his head with a piece of string. The autopsy found that a .38 caliber bullet had entered Joel's skull just behind his left ear. On May 16th, the Atlanta Police Department received a telephone tip from a woman who said she'd met a man matching the newspaper description of the Appalachian Trail murder suspect, and they were told the location of the apartment where he lived. Agent Thompson and Sheriff Baker drove to Atlanta, where police obtained a search warrant. When they arrived, he wasn't home, but inside they found Joel's backpack, his clothes, and camping gear, and a revolver containing 4 live rounds and 1 empty cartridge. Thompson waited inside for Ralph to return, and he was quickly arrested. The man was later identified as Ralph Howard Fox, 31 years old, from Detroit. He had been involved in several crimes in his youth, including kidnapping a girl from a party he threw while his parents were away. At 17 years old, he was arrested for a car theft. At 18 years old, he was arrested again for breaking and entering. In 1963, he went to New Mexico with a 15-year-old girl called Ann and was arrested for statutory rape and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. He married Ann, and a few months later, in March 1964, with Ann pregnant, Ralph forced a Detroit high school junior into his car at gunpoint, then drove her 13 miles to a wooded lover's lane in Troy, Michigan. Fortunately, a vigilant police officer happened to come up on them as he was tying the girl's hands behind her back. He was given a 15-year sentence for the crime, but he served only a small part before he escaped from the Michigan State Prison in Jackson. At this point, Ann divorced Ralph. In October of 1969, he was recaptured in Miami and returned to the Michigan State Prison. While out on parole, he broke into Ann's apartment and lay in wait for her. When she walked in, he opened fire with a rifle, but fortunately missed. Then he headed for New Orleans, then Fort Lauderdale, and after Fort Lauderdale, he landed in Atlanta. This is where he started on the Appalachian Trail for the first time, 5 days before killing Joel in May 1974. Margaret picked Ralph out during a police lineup. He admitted to owning the gun, which he said he had bought in Florida on a Florida beach, but it was later matched to the bullet taken from Joel's head. He confessed to stealing Joel's gear and to kidnapping Margaret, but said he had no intention of harming her. Ralph Fox was indicted for murder the following October 1975 and pleaded guilty to the charges, and after was sentenced to life in Georgia State Prison. In July 1991, Ralph was given a 1-month reprieve from his prison sentence to attend the funeral of his brother in Michigan, and then he was paroled. He moved to Lapeer County, Michigan, about 50 miles north of Detroit. After 7 months, he failed to appear at a meeting with his parole officer and didn't turn up at home. And he didn't turn up at his home. They also found evidence that a car had recently been stuck in the mud. After checking local towing companies, they discovered one of the drivers was Ralph Fox. Police issued a nationwide alert, and 2 days later, he was arrested in Skagit County, Washington, as he tried to break into a parked car. He was tried in Lapeer in that November, and Ralph denied the murder charge. The jury, under Circuit Judge Martin E. Clements, declared him guilty. In June 2003, he was transferred to the state prison hospital. He died there the following month from lung cancer. So in July of 2003, Ralph died in a Michigan state prison from lung cancer. So what we're going to do, I'm just going to kind of recap this whole situation in my own words instead of reading from an article like I just did. So Joel and Margaret decide they had met before the idea or plan to hike the trail. And they decided that they wanted to hike the trail together. So they, on March 9th, 1974, they set out and left Springer Mountain, hiking northbound on the Appalachian Trail. Being new hikers, they both kind of got in over their head. Margaret got a blister on her feet pretty quickly after they started, and they decided to make shelter at the Low Gap shelter along the Appalachian Trail. When they arrived at the Low Gap shelter, there was already a man there named Ralph. Ralph was kind of acting suspicious. He was kind of irritating Joel, following Joel around, just giving off bad vibes. Margaret later recounted that he was just kind of not all there, and she thought that he was sort of she explained it as being dirty and not having the proper gear, but that's kind of commonplace for an AT thru hiker, is being dirty and having small amounts of gear. Joel and Margaret decide that they want to get away from Ralph as quickly as possible, so they talk about it before bed, and they decide that first thing in the morning they're going to leave. They get up at first light, start getting ready to leave. Joel goes over to the nearby stream or spring to wash his face and brush his teeth, and Ralph kind of comes out of nowhere and he shoots Joel. He comes back, he takes Margaret and ties her up, leads her into the woods, ties her to a tree, comes back, he hides Joel's body, and then he decides to untie Margaret, brings her back to the shelter. After finding out they don't have any cash and all they have is traveler's checks, he decides that he doesn't want to deal with Margaret anymore, leads her further into the woods, ties her to a tree again. This time he ties her hands behind her back, I guess, with the intentions that she could get free. He leaves a watch and some food in her lap. He leaves a note in the shelter saying that she was 200 yards from the shelter, tied to a tree, and then he leaves. He's gone for some amount of time, decides that he can't leave her there because he thinks no one will find her. He unties her and decides to take her and kidnap her, and they leave on the trail together, headed northbound, going to alternate 75 out of Cleveland, which is Unicoi Gap. They pass a couple people on the way to Unicoi. They finally make it to Unicoi. They bum a ride back into Helen. They find a place that will cash their traveler's checks without an ID. They end up getting a hotel room. Ralph was supposed to let Margaret go at this point. He decides that he's not going to do that, that they're going to go to the bus station together. So they go to the bus station together. He gets on a bus going to Atlanta. She gets on a bus going to Columbia. His bus arrives before hers does, and she watches him leave. Now, at this point, it's kind of why didn't she leave? Why didn't she go to the police immediately right then while she was still in the North Georgia area? Instead, she gets on her bus and heads to Columbia, South Carolina, where I'm assuming her parents are. So she's probably just looking for support. She can't get a hold of her parents. She can't get a hold of her brother. So she calls the police in Columbia, South Carolina, starts filing a report about what happened. The police in Columbia contact the police in Atlanta. The sheriff in Atlanta contacts the GBI, Georgia Bureau of Investigation. There's a big investigation to open on this guy. They find out through another civilian that she had seen this guy at a certain area. They go there. Sure enough, Joel's backpack is found. The gun with the cartridge was found, and so the sheriff's kind of waited around. Sure enough, Ralph shows up. He gets arrested. He was in prison for quite a many years. They let him out to go to his brother's funeral. He escapes. he ends up killing someone else in Michigan after he carjacked their car and then got it stuck in the mud. He's on the run. He finally gets caught again, and they put him in prison again, and then he died in 2003, which serves him right. He should have died sooner than that for killing 2 people. So interestingly enough, the Low Gap shelter that they're talking about is in North Georgia. It's not far from my house. I have actually hiked and stayed at that shelter, I don't know, probably 4 times, maybe 5 times. I have also gotten water out of the spring by the shelter where Joel's body was hidden, probably 4 or 5 times or more, the same amount of times I've been there to that shelter. I have hiked that whole section that they hiked from Low Gap Shelter North to Unicoi. I have been down to Chattahoochee Gap where they got water when it was Rocky Knob Shelter. I've been all in that area, and it's until I started doing research for this particular series that I wanted to start, I had no idea that the very first documented murder along the AT was actually in North Georgia, in an area that I frequently quite a bit. And I've talked to a few of my friends since this, and apparently it was common knowledge. So why I didn't know about it, I'm not sure. But apparently the shelter is called Murder Shelter, and the tree where she was tied up is actually marked, so you could hike there and you could see the tree where she was actually tied to. None of these things I knew. I didn't know it was called Murder Shelter, and I have never seen the tree. And so this first solo style episode was kind of, I know it was kind of all over the place because I'm actually reading from an article. So what I'm going to try to do is for the next solo style, I'm going to try to have just some basic notes together and try to understand the majority of the story without having to read. I know it sounds like I'm reading from a prompter, which essentially I am. I'm reading from a computer screen, but moving forward, I expect the solo styles to get a little better. The next solo style episode will be on the same subject. It will be murder along the AT, but it will be the second documented murder. And then we'll follow along. There's 13 total documented murders at this current time in history. So I've got at least 13 solo episodes just on the murders along the AT. Once I cover all the murders, then we'll move into things like people being kidnapped and people disappearing. Thanks for coming along, and I hope you guys will listen. All right, man, before we close this out, I have a favor to ask from the audience. One, could you please be sure you subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening so that you can receive all new episodes right when they're released. And then if you could, go ahead and head over to iTunes or the Apple Podcast app and leave a review. Man, tell us what you enjoyed or what we could do better. Offer up a guest recommendation, etc. This will help tremendously in letting Apple know that people are actually enjoying the content, and it will help us be put into the search engines or recommended more often in the search engines. And lastly, Dirtbag Adventures is on several social platforms, including YouTube. Really, the best way to reach this content is by going to www.dirtbagadventurespodcast.buzzsprout.com. And then once you're on the website, you'll see the podcast episodes down at the bottom in chronological order. And then at the top of the homepage, you'll find all of the social links for the other various platforms that Dirtbag Adventures is on. And thank you again for joining me in this episode of the Dirtbag Adventures podcast. Catch you on the next one.